Pentecost, which will be followed by Advent. Might be a little scary to think that's right around the corner. Maybe it's not for y'all. It's a very busy time for me. But then again, so is Charge Conference season, which is where we are now. But that's neither here nor there. This morning, here, we find ourselves in the 13th chapter of Luke, and I'll be reading from the Common English Bible. If your translation is a little different from mine, if you brought a Bible with you, or if you've got the text on a screen in front of you, if your translation is a little different from mine, that's all right. Somewhere in between the words on your page and the words on mine, there is a word that God will speak to us together. A reading from Luke. Jesus was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath. A woman was there who had been disabled by a spirit for 18 years. She was bent over and couldn't stand up straight. When he saw her, Jesus called her to him and said, "Woman, you are set free from your sickness." He placed his hands on her, and she straightened up at once and praised God. The synagogue leader, incensed that Jesus had healed on the Sabbath, responded, "There are 6 days during which work is permitted. Come and be healed on those days, not on the Sabbath day." And the Lord replied, "Hypocrites! Don't each of you on the Sabbath untie your ox or donkey from its stall and lead it out to get a drink? Then isn't it necessary that this woman, a daughter of Abraham, bound by Satan for 18 long years, be set free from her bondage on the Sabbath day?" When he said these things, all his opponents were put to shame, but all those in the crowd rejoiced at the extraordinary things he was doing. Friends, hear what the Spirit is saying to God's people. You may be seated. Let the words of my mouth and meditations of my heart be pleasing to you, Lord, my rock and my Redeemer. A lot of y'all are students of the Bible and students of the gospel, some deeper than others, and some of you will remember some of these stories better than others of you do. But have you ever noticed that a lot of our gospel stories start somewhere really specific? They start with a place that's named, or maybe at least you can go back a couple more stories and find out, where does this all start? A lot of those locations would have meaning to their contemporary audience. You know, folks would know the difference between, say, Bethphage and Tyre, much like we would know the difference between, say, Kingsport and Asheville. Right, now, can you all picture both of those places in your mind? Maybe I shouldn't ask this, but has anyone not been to both Kingsport and Asheville? I choose those because they're close. Okay, so we have a minimum of unfamiliarity with those, and that's okay. When you go to Asheville, don't go to the mall. Go anywhere but to the mall. Asheville is a neat town with some really cool character, but not that particular place. Now, that's just me, right? I have a very specific picture of Asheville in my mind. I have a way in which I was introduced to Asheville, and then I discovered this other place. And so the picture in my mind of Asheville and of Kingsport are weighted with memory and probably no small bit of judgment. Maybe it's best to just confess that and have it out of the way. This story today, though, this is a story without that particular baggage. Jesus was teaching where? In a synagogue where? We don't know. We have no idea. Jesus was teaching in one of the synagogues. So apparently for Luke, where isn't important. It doesn't matter if it was in Jerusalem or Bethphage or somewhere else. Who even knows? Where isn't important? What cities? It's irrelevant. What's relevant is not the spatial context, but the temporal context. Jesus was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath. That's right. Which is different by 24 hours than what we usually celebrate as the Sabbath. This would be Saturday, the last day of the week. And that's the context that we need to understand. That's the context we need to see when the trouble comes in. The synagogue is where teaching is supposed to happen. Great! That's exactly what's happening here. No biggie. The synagogue is the right place to be on the Sabbath, and that's a good day for teaching. Cool. The Sabbath is not, however, the right day to mow the lawn. Some of y'all have mowed the lawn on the Sabbath. I've mowed the lawn on Sunday. This is my confession to you. I need to mow the lawn. It's 2 weeks overdue. But that's the rule, right? Sabbath means no work. If you're part of an Orthodox Jewish community, approaching Sabbath means that you find a place to be that is within walking distance of the synagogue. Or you find a place to live where you're in a community that's that close. Because you can only walk so far. You can only do certain things. There are really specific rules about what you can and cannot do on Sabbath. They're written, unlike the mowing the lawn rule for us. That's a cultural norm that for some reason people get really fired up about. You can do all your gardening. You can take your cows out to pasture. That's fine. You cannot mow the lawn. I have no idea why. It blows my mind. But that's the background. Jesus is teaching in a synagogue on the Sabbath, and this woman catches his attention. She doesn't say a word. Not that Luke tells us, but Jesus notices her. Now, I'm going to assume that you have at some point in your life seen someone who's bent over from age or from injury. Or just from being tired, maybe. But let's assume it's age or injury in this case. I'm going to assume that you have someone in mind. For me, one of the most joyful and one of the most powerful people in one of my earlier appointments was so bent over that she could barely have a face-to-face conversation. She couldn't even look forward when she was sitting. Her back was this dramatically arched thing, and so she always looked at people, much like I'm looking at you right now, kind of out of the very top of her range of vision. Now, when you do this, you have to open your eyes pretty wide, right? And that dries you out. It's a pretty painful thing to do for a long time. So I would pointedly reposition myself to have a conversation with her or to greet her even on a Sunday morning, to make sure that my face was as close to her line of sight as possible. My goal was, to minimize her discomfort, to include her as well as I could. Which is not to say that she pointedly needed inclusion. She was the matriarch of that church. She was respected. She was pointedly included in every decision that needed to be made. It was amazing how that happened. What she said was what happened, even down to the no dancing rule in the fellowship hall. God rest her beautiful soul. She's the person I see in this woman who catches Jesus' attention. Do you have someone? Her posture stands out. She looks different from everyone else. But unlike the saint at that appointment that I had served a few years ago, in the case of this woman, her posture is hindering her ability to fully participate in the life of that synagogue community. And I think that's what catches Jesus' attention. She's ostracized by her disability. So Jesus calls out to her. And that word, that verb that Jesus does here, by the way, can also refer to him hollering across the room, "Hey, Dean!" Not that I have to holler in here because I have a microphone. Ha ha! I got the power. The word can mean the same thing. It's a calling out to someone. And maybe calling out to her would have caused less trouble. It would have been at least less disruptive. I don't know. Do y'all holler in church? We're not shouting Methodists much anymore. We used to be that 150 years ago. I guess I do sometimes. I guffaw when I find something really amusing. And it can be disruptive, and I apologize for that. I can get excited. And some of y'all who like a quieter and more sacrosanct space might find that gets on your nerves, and I apologize. I'm sorry. Maybe I'll try to be more reverent. But Jesus won't. Woman, you are set free from your sickness. He's not quiet about it. He calls her out. He calls attention to her. And then he touches her. That, by the way, is how we know he's not just calling across the room. He touches her. But he still makes that proclamation to her. He still disrupts his own teaching for the sake of saving this woman, bent over for 18 years. Y'all picture 18 years of your life. And then picture 18 years of your life in a culture in which 35 to 40 is a really long life. He saves her from this infirmity of 18 years, from this disability that has defined her in this community. That's a long time. And as we approach it, on a side note, I want to point out that Luke contradicts himself in his own theodicy here. Luke introduces this woman as being disabled by a spirit. But Jesus doesn't cast a spirit out of her. Jesus heals her from her sickness. And you know what Luke does with that difference? Nothing. Thanks for that. He just lets the contradiction sit there. And maybe for Luke there is no contradiction. Maybe there's not a difference. I mean, I'm convinced that a lot of what earlier cultures understood as demonic involvement is in fact the evil of infirmities of various sorts. They're not less evil, but they're not personified. So Jesus heals this woman from her sickness, from her infirmity, from what in that culture had to be understood as a spirit that was keeping her bent over. Jesus heals her from it. He makes her well. He gives her firmness of body and spirit, and she straightens up and once, and she does what? She praises God. If Jesus hadn't made a scene already, she starts doing it. Ooh, I would love to have heard it. If y'all haven't done it yet, I want to invite you to get yourself an invitation to a synagogue service. And listen to those saints praising in those old Hebrew songs. It is ethereal, y'all. It is life-changing. It's transformative. She shouts and she sings and she dances because praise is her gift. And she hasn't been able to do it for 2 decades. See, the devil doesn't exploit your weakness. The devil undermines your strengths so that you can't use your gifts. She praises. She makes a scene in that quiet little synagogue where Jesus is just calmly teaching. And the synagogue leader sees this whole thing, and he doesn't scold Jesus for interrupting Jesus' own lesson. Because, I mean, the people they're transfixed by Jesus. It happens everywhere he goes. Remember, he teaches as one with authority. The synagogue leader won't call him out. So he calls out the disruptive woman. And Jesus says, no. Listen, if I choose to save this woman for what's kept her bound for 2 decades, I choose the time and the place of the deed as well. You don't get to say how or when it happens. We have coming to us today a reading from the letter to the Hebrews as well. It's fascinating to juxtapose it with this lesson and with our lesson from the introduction to Jeremiah this morning. The author says, you haven't come near to something that can be touched. Burning fire, darkness, shadow, hearkening back to what happens on Sinai, the cloud and the fire and the smoke and the noise. Things that the people could touch, things that surrounded Moses as he was up on the mountain, drawing close to the very presence of God. The author says, you haven't come near to that, but you've come near to the very presence of Christ. Something that can't be touched. You've drawn near to Jesus and the mediator of a new covenant. But I would argue this morning that we can touch Jesus, and we can be touched by Jesus. And Jeremiah and Isaiah, I think, would argue exactly the same thing. You remember Jeremiah's call narrative? Oh, it is so cool. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. I set you apart as a prophet to the nations. And Jeremiah says essentially the same thing Moses says. I don't know what I'm doing here. I don't have words. And God reaches out to Jeremiah and touches him on the mouth. Touches his lips. Imagine God's hand touching your lips. When God calls Isaiah, the servant of God, the messenger of God, reaches out with a burning coal from the altar and touches Isaiah's lips. We have a God who reaches out and touches us. We have a God who reaches out and heals us. We have a God who's not afraid to tear down that veil that keeps us from the Holy of Holies, who's not afraid to break down the separation between heaven and earth, who just longs for us, in fact, to find those thin places where you can see heaven happening. God longs to touch us. And God longs to pour out power so tangibly through us that we can reach out and be the power of God touching someone else. That is God's power that God will pour out through you if you're just willing. If you make yourself available for it. And it can happen in surprising ways. You'll find that through you, the weak can be made strong, the bent over can be straightened up, and people can be freed to use the gifts that God gives to them to be a blessing to each other. And probably to bless you in surprise, even though you may have thought you were the vessel of the blessing. We have a God who longs to touch us. We have a God who knows us more intimately than we could ever know ourselves. And that is a God who is empowering you today. That's a God who's making you a healer today. That is a God who's sending you out to be everything that God needs you to be. To be healing and forgiveness and power in a world desperate for the love of God. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. The woman straightened up and she praised God. This is the Lord of the dance, y'all. So let's sing of God's praise this